Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for having me. It's my first time in Prague, so I'm very touched to have been invited by the whole organizing team and especially Julian. It's Julian's fault for the title, so he should take responsibility. He's back there. Because I said to him, what do you want me to talk about? He said, well, what about no coding without decoding? And so it means now I have to go through the decoding with you. First, decoding is this acronym of MIL, M-I-L, that stands for Media and Information Literacy, which we're all doing, sometimes without knowing it, but maybe we would all benefit in clarifying the term. So that you know where I'm speaking from, I'll be speaking from a perspective of research, and especially a research project that we are conducting in France, which is called Transliteracy, that is government-sponsored. But I'm also talking from a perspective of a UNESCO chair that I call forwardance, and we may want to come about that on that again. I have a lot of slides, I'm afraid, because we have a lot of results that I wanted to share with you. So there'll be accelerations so that you come back to me later. And also, of course, we can expand if we have a few moments for question time. This no coding without decoding question was raised because I think in all our European countries at the moment, we have a sense of urgency about what's happening with education on the one hand, with media, and with media education altogether. This sense of urgency is astonishing because in many ways, at the moment, media education has it all, basically. We have a directive, we have inductive pedagogies that are being recognized at last because of the digital possibilities. But there is a very strong industrial lobby at the moment that is pushing for computer literacy, despite the rest. And we're sort of in parallel tracks and not meeting when I would make the case with you that it is urgent that computer literacy and media and information literacy converge. But it's true that media literacy also has to make an effort, the effort to make the transition to the digital realities and use the different affordances that are offered by the digital world. If not, I'm afraid we may be marginalized. So it's very important that we try to define what the digital is doing to us. And I would propose that the digital is doing something called augmentation by different philosophers and thinkers, and especially the first one, of course, Douglas Engelbart in the 60s in Stanford. But at the moment, what augmentation looks like is human-enhanced technologies, which is to say that we're all being equipped with a ton of devices that act as accessories of augmentation. And also the environment is being augmented with a ton of accessories that make it intelligent like us humans. And so it's this environment that we have to pay attention to because it makes us move from what I used to call the shuttle screen situation, where kids had in their bedroom computer screens, TV screens, etc., very heavy-duty stuff, to this lighter shuttle screen situation, Web 2.0, where all the screens are on one screen. She's watching something, a TV program on a computer screen, to this, which is the next transition to which we're moving. This is in Spanish, but it says it's the digital substitute to your eyes. And this is the total substitution. Okay? This happens because of the semantic web and what's called the Internet of Things. For the moment, we don't think about it too much, but it's already there. And I want us to think in this context, how media literacy can evolve. The Internet of Things presents itself as a way of connecting people, places, and things. I doubt it, but that's what it says. It's at the moment is more sort of the Internet of everything. It's things, systems, information, virtual entities, blah blah. And the question I would like to share with you is, where is the Internet of Citizens, and as we are now calling it in the Council of Europe, the Internet of Creative Citizens, and how can MEL foster it? Because I think MEL has a pivotal role to play. So if we do research, and how do we do research on this augmentation in MEL? I think we need to assess the digital affordances for what they are and as they affect information, because the digital doesn't exist if we don't understand that it is driven by information. Information in all different stages. News, the old media literacy was about news, but the current media literacy also takes into account documents, data, even code. And this is where we have to speak with the computer literacy people. We have to look at the competences, but not only, also the finalities and the values we want to give to MEL. And we need to validate strategies for policymakers. The one thing I didn't tell you when I presented myself is that I'm not only speaking from a research perspective, but also from an activist perspective, which I think we all are in part. And basically, we are in the broader context of 21st century skills, and we have to make sure that they're not defined without us, which at the moment they might be. And we also, when we do this kind of research, we have to be aware of three potential risks for MEL. Is the pre-digital school form ready to deliver MEL? Not sure. What is the new perimeter of MEL, and is it sustainable? If we augment MEL, can we have the forces to do it? Or is it going to stay dead letter, which is not a good thing? And how to avoid the bifurcation that is appearing in some countries between computer literacy and the other literacies. So I think it's doing research with these questions in mind that we can advance together. The methodologies for doing that are complex, and we need to work in teams, I think. It's impossible to do it all on your own. And we need to work in a kind of holistic way, which is to say the research we do on the ground has to feed practices, has to feed policies, and then they have to feed back what's happening in schools. And I think we can't compartmentalize research too much these days. So the perspective I'll be taking is from information and communication sciences, but also the didactics of computer sciences, because they are the ones who are most likely to want to speak to us, at least from my experience. Maybe you have other experiences, but also the sociology of action, not just staying in ivory towers of research. And that allows us to ask questions about the modes of interaction in MEL, what pedagogical patterns and stances we can take in MEL in schools and beyond. And also we have to recombine this, it's not easy because it's already a huge field, with observation of professional practices, of users of young people and how they interact with each other, and how this again is taken into account in public policies. And so here we are. Complex. The questions that we can ask at this level is what kinds of access, for which communities, and it feeds back onto what modes of interactions, what pedagogical stances. Okay, if you see what I mean. And that's basically what we've tried to do with ANR Translate, which is about a team about 40 people, and we're looking at this convergence of media literacy, computer literacy, and information literacy as we are seeing it happen in a very chaotic way, at least in France, but I think in other parts of Europe and the world. And we gave ourselves 4 tasks. The mapping of who the actors are, where they are located, what kind of actions and events they organize. Observation and uses, I call it dispositif à la Foucault, because there's power behind that, and one has to keep it always in mind. None of this is neutral. And then another task is going to put all these different heterogeneous data together. This is next year. You're not going to have results of that today. And also, of course, at the end, but also in the meanwhile, modeling and looking at the consequences of public policies. Is that all right? So again, it's all imbricated tasks. I'll be speaking mostly today about results from task 2 and task 4. The objectives of task 2 were to observe young people and see how their digital competences combined or not media literacy, information literacy, etc. So we were looking at hybrid situations, we were looking at what their strategies were there overlapping users, and we tried to follow them up over time, actually for 3 years. And as you know, in our field, it's very difficult to have longitudinal data. We usually tend to do one spot research. So as a result, our methodology is combines several modes: massive inquiry, observation in formal and informal situations, and portraits. And the objectives of task 4 were to look at public policies in terms of a template that would have different dimensions of public policy. Definition of mail over time, official documents, resources, training, funding, evaluation, other actors than the state. As you know, that mail is often carried on by civil society or even in some countries by the private sector in conjunction with civil society or of the state. And of course, a set of good practices. And the question that was driving us behind these public policies at this time, at the end of the project, we will be re-evaluating this, was why did we have a feeling of urgency and stalling? And was it because media education is being shifted around by digital convergence? And as a result, we did an analysis and a report for France, and then a whole network of colleagues from the COST European Network Transforming Audiences, Transforming Society joined us to do reports on their own countries. You can find these reports on our website, and I'll come back to them in a minute. We started with a definition of transliteracy that came from Sue Thomas, so from England. The ability to read, write, interact with platforms and other communication tools, from visual to oral means, such as press, television, etc. So basically, transliteracy is everything. And you see right away the problem of perimeter. How do we define it? How do we make it work if it's too ample? But at the same time, she was right about one thing that the research confirms. For young people, this is not a problem. They are on all these different media, and they don't see the separations that we have historically created or disciplinary created. So where we are in fragmentation, they are in flux and circulation. And so this is what we have to take into account, I think, from the perspective of researchers and their reality, and see how we bring more articulated perspectives on that, and not just their practice. So it gave a lot of currency to the word literacy, in fact, and I think in all countries now, in France in particular, we now use it as a French word, which it was not at the beginning. And for us, it's this ability to search, evaluate, test, modify information online. And the trance comes from the idea that these practices that young people have should be transferable or might be transferable to other spheres than their leisure sphere. And we thought we positioned transliteracy at the crossroads of three literacies: media literacy, information literacy, and computer literacy. And this is what we see. We see them not only in their bedroom, but also in spaces that are very informal spaces, even at school, learning centers. And this is how their information culture looks like. They still have paper, They work with paper, but they also interact a lot with each other, and they navigate and they scroll, etc., etc. I think it's very familiar. I'm afraid it's also our universe as researchers. But this brings us to a more concrete approach than what I've shown you in terms of the Internet of Things and the kind of utopias that are around there. So quickly, some preliminary results. In schools, we have a confirmation that there is an emerging transliteracy, and that the frame of reference for young people and teachers alike is the digital, though they don't know really what's under it. It's not media and information literacy. So we have to deal with that. What we see is that tasks and activities are hybridized. So all the talk of they're always online, not true. They need paper and they believe in paper, especially symbolically, and when they have to do a few tasks, especially tasks of organization. There's also a very strong feeling of expertise among these young people, but according to tasks. They don't claim to be expert in everything, but they will claim expertise. The use of digital tools is extremely heterogeneous and varied, and it appears most in project-based situations, not in traditional subject matters, but in the project-based transdisciplinary school projects. And what appears there is that all these free competencies, these transliteracies around media, around information, augment as the group shares. They make each other competent and expert by conducting projects. And so it's not digitally driven, it's project driven. In other words, if you have the computers but you don't know how to deal with a project, it won't happen. This is where we need MIL and not just computers in the schools. The three dimensions in which knowledge builds when they play with these different competences, with different transliteracies, is search for information. So it confirms our idea that the digital is information driven, and it's cultures of information that are at the heart of what we should be analyzing, and not the nebulous sphere of the digital. Writing and synthesis, that's where the offline and the text and the paper comes back in, and communication, which is interactive, and that's what Web 2.0, with all its social media, brings in. So they're in a state of flux, and they circulate between these different spheres. They don't circulate easily between the private sphere of the house and the bedroom, the digital bedroom, and the school. This is probably the divide that we are still finding, and they will be very reluctant, in fact, to bring their home practices and their leisure practices to the school environment. Same thing for the teachers, by the way. Teachers who are digital natives, as we call them, have had access to the digital via their leisure, and they don't see why they should apply this to work. This is something to take into account into the reality compared to the utopian Internet of Things. And maybe they're right. Maybe they are being savvy citizens by doing that. Why blur the sphere of labor and leisure? Good question. Outside schools, we told ourselves in our hypothesis that there would be much more transliteracy because it's not controlled by subject matters. Well, we are disappointed at the moment because we still find that there is a lot of difficulty, as I call it, to surrender the old forms of schooling, even out of school. The learning by imitation is still more powerful than the learning by doing or creating. And there's a lot of resistance there. So it's something to take into account. And definitely there appears a lot of confirmation of what we felt were operational competences compared to editorial competences. They're still separate, or at least they are together only with different individuals, not necessarily in one individual, which makes me think that we need to push towards what I call distributed competences, competences within a group rather than an individual. And this is probably where the digital is the strongest and where mail could be augmented by the digital into bringing in participatory research, participatory learning rather than individual learning. And again, even outside schools, there is little evidence of transfer. So generally, we see that there is a construction of transliteracy and it's technology mediated. There is a process of socialization and individuation, and the media remain central. So the media remain the fuel for the digital because of communication and information. And definitely there is some new spaces appearing for writing, reading, and publishing. So what implications for mail in schools? This is where now the observation comes towards the modeling, if you follow where I am, about objective of task 2. It is urgent, it seems, to model transliteracy and to see how transliteracy and mail can work together. Media, information literacy, and computer literacy. And if we look at the traditional models for literacy in the pre-digital times, the dominant ones, and they're still very present, are transmission and competence. This is how most schools function, and media literacy is tributary to that. But media literacy has always held another discourse, as you know, which is that it's about citizenship and it's about creativity. These two models in the pre-digital era were often difficult to bring in, especially in the schools. So the way we model that in pre-digital era is like this. You have media literacy, and it has 3 major competences, and we can go back to Carrie Bassengate, for instance, but others all over Europe we're more or less in agreement. There's the comprehension of the culture, there's critical thinking, there's creativity, and it's split between what happens within schools and outside schools. That's before 2005, 2007, before Web 2.0. Transliteracy brings in a new model. Participation model at the bottom. And the participation model bolsters creativity. And so what we're seeing in the transliteracy model in our observations is that participation, working in groups, sharing, constructing together, and creativity are upsetting the formal model, even though the institutions still have a hard time surrendering that. But it's happening outside. And there is a convergence between info media, info documents, and info data. Maybe not info code, but definitely in media, data are taking more and more an important role. And so our proposal, if we were going to speak to the people in the computer literacies, is to say, okay, code is your domain, but data is a shared domain. And journalism also uses data, and school now are using data and learning analytics, etc., etc. So we can see how we can share a certain number of concepts and notions between these 3 literacies. And so having an epistemology of this becomes possible. And what we see also is this emergence, not of individual competences, and this is the augmentation I'm talking about, the emergence not in individual competences of people, but in the distributed competences of groups, operational, editorial, organizational. Also, I don't know if you've noticed, but in augmentation there is a suffix -tion. But it's true in a lot of the actions that we do today and a lot of the pedagogies we do today. I find myself doing a lot of online pedagogies, and now we don't speak about pedagogical scenarios. We talk about seniorization. We don't speak about edition, we talk about editorialization. We don't talk about documents, we talk about documentarization. People in the library science even talk about the re-documentarization of the world. I mean, it's just enormous, and this expansion. It's big words for a perception that, in fact, everything that used to be static and well positioned and well defined is now in action. The "schon" suffix shows action, shows that things are changing, evolving, being augmented. And of course, it's complicated to transmit into schools. So what's happening is that if you look at transliteracies, the augmentation is enormous. The model I showed you before would be subsumed into the top one, into infomedia. The pre-digital competences were in infomedia. Now we have to add to MIL, we have to add what the document does to media and what data does to media. This is where we'll be able to incorporate and to discuss the augmentation of and the convergence that we are looking at without being marginalized. We ourselves have to move and amplify our field to incorporate what's happening to documents and their evaluation, their curation, and to data and their visualization. If we don't do that, we'll be marginalized. In our observation, it is already happening. In the practices of young people, this is already happening, but we are not verbalizing it into MIL, and it's important that we do it, because everybody, especially in the policy-making world, but also in the teaching world, needs clarification about these concepts and how they can be appropriated and how can they can be incorporated into their practices of every day. So what our research shows also is that pedagogy is back. For a long time, in the last 20 or 30 years, pedagogy was a bad word in academia and in education. For reasons I don't want to enter into here, I think they are historical, sometimes well-earned, sometimes not, but pedagogy is back. And the need for pedagogy as mediation, not as authority, but as mediation is back. Mediation between what? The tasks at school and out of school. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of learning happening outside school. Why leave it out? There's a need for minimal conditions of learning, especially project, follow-up by teachers on literacies and not just programs. And the teachers right now, in the pre-digital context, are focused mostly on programs. They have a program to achieve at the end of the year. They look up to their authority, they don't look down at the kids, and as a result, it can be a very violent situation in classes. And there's got to be some technological facilitation by schools, but also by the technology platforms themselves. We notice in our observation that there's 3 factors that can help this integration of pedagogical mediation. The collective strategies combined to the individual ones, and recognition of both, and yet evaluation today still in schools remain individual. So as long as we don't move towards collective, we are never going to get the whole picture and the whole augmentation of MIL. Distributed competences, I'm not going back on these, and pedagogical mediation, but it is also a mediatization. Now we need technologies to make dynamics in our own classes. This is not possible to read. I'm sorry I have to apologize, I couldn't magnify it, but it just shows you how if you put a project at the center, you're going to have on top the mediation between teacher and learner, and at the bottom, the mediatization between dispositive, realizations, technology, and they all interact. They can't interact on one single individual, and media education cannot be anymore on one single individual. It has to be on a group. It has to be about a project that is carried forth by the whole team with scaffolding at the back. But we need to add and recognize And that's complicated, but that's the Internet of Things. We need to recognize that there is now a digital mediation that is driven by the machine, and by, at least by man-machine interaction. And we have to incorporate this in MEL to be able to use all these affordances. It's what I call the Repertoire of E Strategies. I'm following Jenkins, but Jenkins, not the Jenkins of 2011 or 12, the Jenkins of 2009, who showed how there are strategies online, there are platforms that offer these strategies, so the technology is already there, doing it in a very user-friendly way, and these strategies can be mapped or attached to pedagogies, active pedagogies. For instance, play is not about playing, at least not in schools. Play is about problem solving, I would argue. Serious games, etc. Simulations is about dynamic modeling, and it uses data visualization all the time. And so these things are already there. We need to attach them more and more to pedagogies and verbalize more and more the pedagogy that goes with it, so that we can apply it to different situations. Content aggregation, well, it's about self-discovery very often. Sampling is about remix. That's how you create often. Multitasking is about interaction with tools. Pooling about distributed intelligence. Transmedia navigation is about search, evaluation. Networking is about collaboration, participation, and negotiation. So you can see how these very important augmented elements of the digital can be brought back into the school. And as a result, and this is what we are watching happening right now in France, I don't know if it's the same thing in your countries, we are at last talking to another community that we had left out and that has been emerging and is still not legitimate, which is the community of the digital humanities. They are the ones who interact with man and machine and who see exponential gains in motivation. And eventually we know, and MEL is also about that. And this is part of the mourning we have to do about media education of the pre-digital era. Mourning, we have to leave it behind. It is changing the way we're going to learn and the way we're going to interact with others. And we are at that crucial moment in history when we have to make this feasible in an ethical and constructive way. This is just a challenge I wanted to send you. So what happens is that this digital mediation is now offering us tools that are for non-expert use. We don't have to be computing people today to use the digital. That's the good news. We can have access to language, but through natural language processing. We can have access to history and geography, space, etc., global positioning with GIS. And now we also have the participation dimension that we could not access before, because now we have tools for social networking analysis. We can know how the group and the collective interacts. And so we can base our pedagogy on this. This is augmentation. This is part of a computer literacy world, but it's when the computer literacy can be used by us in our subject matters in MEL. And so we have to embrace it, or at least we have to know it exists out there. And at the moment, we have reached a rather stable consensus about what digital humanities are about, what their augmentation is. It's about NLP, natural language processing. It's about GIS. It's about SNA. If you add to this DV, data visualization, you have the whole augmentation that arrives to us from the computer literacy world. Hence the need for convergence. Because if you look at all these examples I'm giving you, Neatline or Gephi, this is all media. This is all completely mediated. This is all visual, multimedia, it's text, it's sound. It's all media-based and media-driven. The digital is quintessentially about communication in the most possible interactive way. And yet, when you look at the models about the Internet of Things, when you look at the discourse that the computer people are holding or the digital people are holding, they are naturalizing media. They're making them invisible. They're so ambient that they disappear. All we're doing here is mediated. I'm using a media tool. You're taking pictures, etc., etc. All transmission of knowledge has become extremely mediatized today, to the point that it's so natural that we are not mentioning it anymore. The big risk is that the M of MIL disappears into the digital literacies or into the computer literacies. So we do have a fight to fight because media literacy is not about creating computer or code, but it's about being critical about it. It's about exerting ethical thinking about it. When you're coding, you're resolving a very concrete problem. You're not thinking about the ethical consequences of what you're doing. Media literacy, in its oldest, strongest tenets, is about critical thinking, and it's about creativity, but within an ethical background. What we're seeing at the moment, and it's a possibility that is no longer a utopia, and I'm taking the example of MOOCs just because they have a fashion, but also because I happen to be creating a few at the moment, so I'm trying to see how it works. You can see that the learning modes that are possible in MOOCs are all media-based. On the left there, text, graphics, video, audio, simulation, animation. It's putting all together all these learning modes via media, interactivity, see again, visualization, games. The learning models are coming together, and these learning models were implicit always in media literacy, especially the one that is called inductive, especially the one that is called discovery, especially the one that is called apprenticeship. You learn by doing in projects, in media projects. So we are at a moment where the augmentation provided by the digital allows different pedagogies and different learning models that we used to keep separate in terms of feasibility in the classroom. These models can come together, more or less well, of course, with more or less emphasis on one or the other. According to the cultures, it's going to change. Cultures that are more text-based are going to still push for learning modes that are text-based. Others, but there's definitely a moment right now where it's worth watching, where we male people from media education and information literacies, have a role to play in showing how this goes towards the social construction of young people in terms of their being creative and critically minded. The thing is not creating a MOOC, the thing is about socializing young people and constructing them, giving them spine and identity. And it does imply, and this is what the participation model looks like in a MOOC, but it can look like in this new model that is brought in by transliteracy, the participation model. You have, as in all social networks, you have people who stay on the background and watch, lurkers we call them sometimes. There are about 100 here, but then you can have a mass of people who interact crazily. There's 344 in this cluster. And you can measure the centrality, the degree of interaction, who is a hub, who makes more recommendation, who is more organized than others, etc., etc., when you zoom into the cluster I showed you. So this is the potential when I'm talking about creativity, project-based learning, etc. We have a role to play in this consideration of learning models, media, and communication. So for instance, the two MOOCs I'm creating and launching next Monday are one, guess what, on do-it-yourself media and information literacy. and it's a participatory MOOC. Another one is about understanding the pedagogies of Web 2.0. Okay, so we can move media and information literacy into these dimensions and look for the communities of practice and interpretation that are out there. You're still fine? Okay, I'm shifting a little bit the approach. We've done the pedagogy, the first part of the methodology and the questions we had, and let's move to policies, because we need also to include these. And what are the implications in public policies? Well, Task 4 showed a few research results, and this is really a collaborative work with people who are actually in this room and who participated in the cost research. But definitely we noticed that if we have a strong policy framework, we will have strong capacity building. If this doesn't happen, there will be a disconnect. So all these things I've been talking about in the classrooms, if they're not supported by policy, they're not going to happen. So we have to, as researchers, show this research, analysis of the results on the ground, and of course this evidence-based research that we're all striving for. What we saw also in ANR, Translate and cost research is that there was a trompe-l'œil effect, because we found that there was a lot of mail going on. And it's true, there's a lot of project-based experiences going on, but they are not driven or funded necessarily by governments and in schools. They happen because there's a lot of other actors, especially civil society actors, that are involved in it. With the problems that this has, a lot of freedom, but also the fact that these experiences don't scale up. And so they happen in disjointed spaces, and you don't have the certainty that a whole group, a whole age group, will be exposed to this. There's been a lot of holes in exposure, so access, equity of access, is a problem. And who are the communities in charge is a problem. If there's nobody really in charge, we know that policy doesn't work. Can't evaluate, can't reward, can't fund. And we also know that, third point we found, there is this digital undertow that is affecting the frontiers of media education as we knew it. For instance, we see that in lots of countries, media literacy stands alone only in about a fourth of the models, the schools. It is being challenged or complemented, it depends, with information literacy, computer literacy, and something new we hadn't put in the transliteracy model, which is digital literacy per se, which very often, in fact, when you look at the detail of the reports, is very close to media literacy. Hence, the temptation at the moment in a lot of countries, and maybe you have experiences to share, to call it digital literacy, to call the whole thing digital literacy. It's happening in northern spheres. In the Francophone world, at the moment, we are adjoining the two. We are saying in Canada, in Belgium, it's about media literacy and digital literacy. But there is a major risk that, for plenty of reasons, economy of speech, whatever, people will go for digital literacies, because digital, at the moment, carries the story. It's the master narrative. And master narratives are not necessarily right, but they impact the imagination. And somehow, media information, media literacy, at the moment, doesn't have the right story to capture the imagination. How do we do it? I'm trying with transliteracy, but it's a word that is difficult to catch. It's very highfalutin, it looks obscure, etc., etc. And I don't mind if digital literacy wins, as long as it contains all the values of Mill. I think that's what we have to ensure is, okay, we know that the media can damage themselves badly, and they're damaging themselves by putting forward stories of digital literacy, but as long as we in schools, we in research, make sure that all the competences of creativity, critical thinking, cultural comprehension are in there, maybe that will be fine. But you see that there is a risk, in my opinion, to lose a word like media in democracy. Digital literacy looks neutral, or at best, technology-driven. Do we want this? So, as long as we have an ethical vision, so I'm coming to my title, we need to have this ethical reflection. We need to push for Internet of Creative Citizens. I am driving at the moment a recommendation by the Council of Europe that is about the Internet of Creative Citizens, and it's on purpose as a complement and a contradistinction to the Internet of Things. We are people behind this, not just people. That's how the machines see us, digits, numbers. We are subjects. We're people who are in control of the way we learn, the way we interact. So subjects is not a word that works in English, which is why I've accepted to change it to citizens, but creative citizens. So this is, watch out, is coming out soon. And the idea is to attach it to human rights. And it's partly what did drive the Paris Declaration on Media and Information Literacy in the Digital Era, where we were all trying to make sure that computer literacy would not obscure and would not absorb what Mill's heritage has been. So you can go and look at it online. It's now part of the GAP Mill, the Global Alliance of Partners for Media and Information Literacy. You have a list of drafters here, and there's a few in the room. You'll notice that Julian is here and Igor is here. Have I forgotten somebody else? Nora? No, you're not here. Okay, so anyway, so we were 8 or 10 of us drafting this, and before it was adopted, and there are people in there who are not from the media literacy field but are interested, like civil society or even business. I'm going to go faster on this. We need principles, public policy that incorporates Mill and digital humanities. At the moment, we don't have it in many countries. In France, we have it by law since 2013, so it's recent, and it's been a fight from the community of practice that we are, pushing for curricula and not programs, for distributed competences. I'm just, telling you what we observed on the ground and how we should push this into policy. Subject matters, we don't necessarily need to disrupt them, but what we should make sure doesn't happen is that informatics bifurcates from information. So you can have training around the project, the way you can have pedagogy around the project. It is not at all what universities and schools are doing at the moment. At the moment, what is happening at universities and in school only happens in the first quadrant on the left, which is to say, subject approaches by teachers. Yes? It's a transmission model. If you want to move to a participation model, you have a transmission model, but it's only a fourth. It's not a monopoly approach. And you can have socio-technical dispositif, and you can have learner contribution. These people know things from outside the school system. They should be brought in the school system and back out. So in terms of implementation, teachers shouldn't be teaching alone. It's going to happen right now because in any case, teaching has become very difficult. Students don't recognize anymore this kind of authority. We should foster intermediary spaces, fab labs, forges, libraries, online platforms, lifelong training. And it works. I can testify to that. For instance, in terms of implementation, CLEMI, the the Center for Liaison and Information and Media Literacy, that I happen to be the director now. I don't claim anything more, because CLEMI has 30 years of existence. It creates learning events, a whole week of learning event called Media and the Press in the schools. It's the second biggest event after the French baccalaureate. 3 million kids involved. Does this tell you something about what they want, these kids, and how they learn? You can also provide resources. CLEMI has also provided an application, an app, where you can play, so you can put these strategies of problem solving, of modeling, also in education. These are downloaded a lot by teachers. It means it's meeting a need, an expressed need on the ground. And so we can close the feedback loop and provide tools to empower teachers and students at the same time. And I hope we keep working together. Anyways, for more information, you can go on Translate and on Eco-Learning. Thank you for your attention.
Is willing to answer a few questions if you would like.
Hey, hi, Renee.
How about a deceptively simple question?
You're a specialist of that.
Some people would say that a small-scale project done inside a particular location, done deeply and well, far exceeds a large-scale one-shot that reaches 3 million children. What would you say to the relative advantages and disadvantages of deeply integrated small-scale projects in relation to large-scale one-offs?
I would say they're not mutually exclusive. They should go together. Why? Because what we experience, at least in CLEMI, is that the large one, which is state-supported, compels teachers who would not be going towards that to try. And they are provided tools easily to adapt in their class, and they're accompanied for a whole week by professionals. So it's a way of creating initiation, if you want. And it can be driven by the kids. I mean, it's the kids who go see the teacher or the librarian and say, we want to participate, we want to be part of it. So that creates a lot of attention on the need for learning events. And then once you know and you see how it works, and I know you've all experienced that, when you see how you recuperate this in your classroom in terms of enthusiasm, but in terms also of knowledge and interaction, then you can decide, oh, but I can do this as often as I can, and this is where you can have a deep knowledge approach. But then for the deep knowledge, you need what I was saying, you need to have a real understanding of the different bricks that you're going to bring in terms of competences, in terms of attitudes that you want, in terms of productions and outcomes that you want. And that's a slower process that you can distill more carefully than in your class. I think what happens, at least in CLEMI, is that the teachers who accompany us in this approach really do it with 3 or 4 projects over the year. And it's already enormous, considering the fact that they are blocked in a way by the program. They are in a very programmatic system in France about their discipline, and they're being inspected. But more and more, the inspection status is changing also, and the body of inspectors is acknowledging and valuing teachers who also have project-based pedagogies. It was not the case about 10 years ago, and so it is, the environment is changing. I think this is the case in France. I suspect it is the case in other places. But we have to keep providing evidence that it works, that it is motivating, and that there is knowledge construction. For me, it's the weak point at the moment, is to show that projects lead to knowledge. Because for people, in people's mind and imagination, projects lead to activities, realizations, they make something, a film, etc., and that's it. So we have to show that projects also construct knowledge, it's a co-construction, and then I think even the school system and the people who are the guardians of the temple, of school as the place of transmission and of knowledge construction, will accept that. We are doing it at the moment with very small projects, deep projects, René, in very derelict places of France that work with Wikipedia people. Wikipedia people come to the schools and the kids build Wikipedia articles about their neighborhood. It's always very situated. I agree with you that deep knowledge is attached to situations and to your environment. But these kids, the Wikipedia can't cover all of France or all of the activities that happen in a neighborhood, and these kids are doing that, and their article becomes a full part of a Wikipedia, which arguably is one of the repositories of knowledge these days, and it's participatory. So you see how it can be incorporated more and more. It doesn't mean one needs coding. That's what I said to the coding people, except that at some point in the design, the kids are going to go and want to go in the back office. And then they'll have two options. One is, oops, where is the coder in the neighborhood? Who in the team has the operational competence of coding? Or they'll go to a tutorial online and they learn how to code. So that's what the coding without decoding proposal is about. Don't teach coding for coding. It's going to be an announced recipe for failure. Give meaning to code. The meaning is often situated meaning. It's really central to a kid and his experience, or to a class, or a cluster and his experience. And then code will come. Code will be improved. And it's very visible in publishing, where people will need to put content online, and so they'll go to coding. And then they learn the right language for coding, because as you know, there's lots of languages, and so which one do we privilege compared to another doesn't make sense. There's another one.
We are actually, right, it's very quick. We are pretty much lunchtime. I just wanted to ask a question about what's the experience of digital coding and
because I was promoting the trans rather than the multiple. Oops. That's short, right? That's a short answer, short part. Well, I didn't want a confusion with what has been associated with multiple earlier, and it's a dominant paradigm in pedagogies with multiple intelligences. And so that's what I would put in the learning models, in the cube. Yes, of course, what it does is that it allows multiple intelligences to come because they are very fluid between the incidental, the inductive, etc. So for me, transliteracy is about facilitating these kinds of intelligences, and they're multiple. But it's multiple because they are transversal. They come into disciplines, but they come into your practices. There's a designer who talks about internet as a material these days, not as a tool. And for me, it's actually a sort of apt metaphor of what is happening if we use it well. We we design it, and we can design our pedagogy like that too. And we are designers of our intelligence. There's moments when we call on our inductive skills or the deductive skills. Sometimes we need to touch in order to understand. Today, this is really being part of the affordances of the digital. But they are meaningless, these affordances, if we don't interpret them back into mail, into what we want to do with mail.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that all of you will wish to thank Davina for a very interesting